Well, thank you for having me. I'm not here by myself, though. Joey Algiers from the National Park Service is here as well. Aside from Joey being an absolutely fantastic collaborator and incredibly knowledgeable, Joey actually leads the work that we're doing at the Project Nursery. Catherine Pacarduni had been the nursery manager until earlier this year. She's gone on to bigger and brighter and better things, and we wish her well. But I had the distinct pleasure of working with Joey on all things at the nursery, along with Julia Samaniego and Jose Campos, who are both employees of the Salmon Fund that work directly with Joey in the nursery. So the way that I thought about going through this tonight is I'd like to get through the slides that I've got and talk about things and show you a whole bunch of stuff to react to as quickly as we can, because honestly, I'd like to get to questions and answer any questions that people have and have dialogue and conversation, because that's more fun than me standing up here presenting and gesticulating everywhere. I also tried to match my shoes to the platform. I got pretty close. So, the Wallis Annenberg Wildlife Crossing, as I go through these slides, I'm going to jump through these different themes, because I think it's important to understand that a project like this is multifaceted, and even though the plants are at the core of the project, they obviously are linked intrinsically to the wildlife that we attract that are going to be across the crossing. It is about restoration of this location. It's important to understand that in typical infrastructure projects, you'd be leading from the structure side, right? In this project, it's being led from the plant side, it's being led from the ecological side, it's being driven that way. And so I thought it would be helpful to kind of go through the stratification of that and kind of touch on each of these different topics. But at the same time, I've also been reading, and I figured that this is an appropriate individual to put a quote up for, since I'm amongst fellow plant nerds here, and bringing up a quote from Alexander von Humboldt. I've been reading a lot of his writings recently, and a lot of things have been written about his work. And as a German polymath and someone who probably desired to be French, as I understand it, he really had this understanding of connectedness of the natural world that led its way all the way through from the most, the smallest speck of moss to the peak of a mountain to the heavens. And so understanding how that interconnectedness drives how we think about design is a big piece for me. But he was also someone who was a passionate collaborator, and so again, thinking about how this project is even though I'm the one that's here speaking tonight, I'm here representing hundreds of people who have been a part of this project, many of whom have been a part of it for far longer than I have. This project is born out of passions of people like Rory Skay and Joe Edmiston and Paul Edelman at MRCA, and Senator Fran Pavley, the first mayor of the city of Agoura Hills, and having the forethought to set aside the area where the crossing is at and really think about this area and preserving it for wildlife. And then I also really like this quote, because it's ultimately perfection and sarcasm at the same time. But it makes its way through every facet of this project as well. So the one thing to understand about the structure of the project is that the partnership is based in collaboration. There are these 5 core partners, right? There's Caltrans as the implementing agency for the crossing, and who I have a close relationship working through the design and the construction process for the project. Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy and MRCA as the land holder for the parcels that exist on the north and south side of the freeway. The National Park Service and all the work that Joey and his colleagues do, the work that Seth Riley and Jeff Sikich have done in researching the California mountain lion and the plight of the California mountain lion over the course of the last 25, almost 30 years of their career. The Local Resource Conservation District has done a lot of work in restoring areas there in and around the crossing site. And then the National Wildlife Federation as the fiduciary partner and ultimately, one of the leaders of this effort being Beth Pratt here in the center of the screen. She's there at P22 Day from a couple years ago with the actress Julia Butters, and everyone knows P22 at this point. P22 being the spokes animal for the project. But really, when I'm talking about being here representing a whole series of other people, this is how I do the work that I do. It's through collaboration, it's through a team approach, it's through having that expertise as a part of the conversation, because I'm very comfortable walking into a room and knowing that I'm the dumbest person there. I want to have all the smarter people in there around me working with me. And so I've got everyone from structural engineers on our team all the way through to my mycologists. I mean, the fact that I'm talking about having a mushroom guy working on a Caltrans project is kind of comical. But for those of you who don't know where the project is located, I threw a couple of these slides up here. Located between Agoura Hills and Calabasas at the Liberty Canyon exit. And we're talking about an area that's been fragmented for over a century. Right? Fragmented habitat because the 101 freeway cuts through the space between the Simi Hills and the Santa Monica Mountains. And the fragmentation of our circulation patterns, the deployment of our circulation patterns is the thing that really does fragment circulation for wildlife. And so in this specific location, we're really zoning in this area where there is not the development. This is this area that has been protected as part of what I had stated earlier about the work that some of the predecessors that have come before on this have invested their time and effort and energies in. But we're talking about the last 1,600 feet along the freeway in this location where we have publicly held lands to the north and to the south of the freeway. And that's important because when you're creating an ecological stitch like this, if you have that landing in an area where you don't have hospitable habitat on either side, it's not going to be quite as successful as when you stitch that back into that habitat. So along this corridor, we have Liberty Canyon Creek that comes down from the north. If I expand the screen out a little bit further, you see the ever so glorious Calabasas landfill to the north as well. Really sexy location for everyone that's going to tour that. And then there's Agoura Road as the feeder road here to the south. And then you can see there's a road right there in the center in that white gray. It's former Vendel Place. It's an abandoned roadway that comes into play as I describe a little bit more about the site. To the north of the freeway, so this is a pretty distinctive picture of the character of the landscape to the north of the freeway at present. This whole area was decimated in the Woolsey fire in 2018. And the area to the north in particular has a just complete overwash of mustard and cheatgrass. Just came back in droves. And MRCA has done a lot to restore this area over time. But it's a pretty substantial hurdle to get over when you get that much area that's impacted by the substantiveness of that fire coming through. And then on the south side of the freeway, we've got some other fun challenges, namely the 66 kV power lines at the top of this pole and the 5 other vendors that share a space on that pole. So we're taking, the reason I point this out is that we're taking all of those utilities and we're actually undergrounding them under former Vendel, which is the paving here in the foreground, both as a means of creating a better connected habitat in the surface that will come across on top of the structure, but also as a way of helping to improve fire resilience and finding ways to bury those logs whenever possible. But not a small feat to have, not only SoCal Edison that we're collaborating with and undergrounding these utilities, but then those 5 other vendors, along with a 30-inch water main that serves everyone from Thousand Oaks to Calabasas. So disruption of those utilities would probably not make too many people happy in that area. So really it's about how do we get to this, right? And I think the other piece that's important for people to understand as part of this project is the incredible amount of communication and education that comes as a part of this. This was a presentation that I gave to the Ladera Stars Academy in Thousand Oaks a couple years ago. It was a 2nd grade class. It was the same time that my son was in 2nd grade, so I felt like I had a good test subject to test the presentation out on beforehand. But I figure if you're communicating something like this, these kind of broad and substantive concepts, if you can present this in such a way that you can present it to a 2nd grader and they get it, then you're probably doing something right. So simple things like this, right? There was habitat there. We did this, not knowing that we really disrupted it. We didn't really understand exactly the degree to which we were disrupting things. We were just trying to deploy our interstate system, right? This is during the Eisenhower era. This is about protecting, the continental U.S. and stretching the roads from coast to coast, right? And so we create that roadway surface, we disrupt the habitat, and now we're trying to find a way to patch that back in. So same thing is true of communicating the different facets of the design process to our collaborators at Caltrans, working with each of the functional units at Caltrans, everyone from the biology team to the structural engineers, the geotech folks, and being able to find accessible means of communicating the importance of all of these different design parameters in a way that is not aggressive, and it's something that's approachable, it's something relatable. So finding ways to use iconography and simplify concepts down so that you can begin a dialogue. And then we generated a 220-page book that became our platform for discussion as the design process evolved. So getting to this point, right? So taking things and getting to this point, it's also about stepping back, right? Looking at the history of the site, understanding how the site has evolved. How did the roadways change? How did that roadway modification manipulate the landscape? How did that change the soil characteristics? How did that change the hydrology? How did that impact how the plant communities evolve these locations? How does the thoroughfare of the 101 and any of the particulate matter coming off of the cars rolling down the road affect the plant communities adjacent? And then thinking again, like, it's not just this classic infrastructure project, right? It's this combination of biotic and abiotic factors that drive the infrastructure project. So, who's our client? The wildlife, right? So this is not meant to be a spreadsheet that anybody can read up there. This is purely up there for backdrop and substance. But what this is representative of the team that we have and the knowledge of all the wildlife biologists that are part of this team, not just that research over the course of the last 25 years that's very focused in this location, but wildlife biologists like Tony Clevenger, whose work is tied back to the crossings that go through Banff National Park up in Alberta, who I've worked with for the last 15, 20 years. Or Robert Fisher and Cheryl Bremy, that are both biologists that are part of USGS and specialize in herpetological species and small mammals. And a whole litany of other folks within the team partnership that are able to provide that resource, that information to understand all of these different facets that influence how we design the space that we're creating. And then we go through, we kind of slice through it. This is us doing our due diligence, doing our homework, understanding everything from the weight and the lifespan, to the home range of the species, to the way that they move, what their mating habits are, their nesting habitats, the type of plant community that they're a part of, what do they eat, what eats them. And then finding things like that, finding ways, sorry, now I'm tripping over the cord and finding ways with graphics like this to develop what's in essence a kind of Rosetta Stone between how the wildlife biologists talk about space and how we as design practitioners need to be able to relay these concepts through to develop them into the drawings that we have to prepare as part of the Caltrans standard. And so we had conversations with the wildlife biologists about open habitat or closed habitat or edge conditions, and being able to define what that means for people that think visually versus people that exist in that space and live and breathe those conditions, and then being able to take those concepts, create these kind of illustrative diagrams so that we can have that dialogue and develop things moving forward. Looking at hydrology, this is a survey from 1900. You can see in the kind of the pale blue color there, that's the combination of Liberty Canyon Creek going to the north and this unnamed creek that kind of stretches off to the west. And this all eventually drains its way down to Malibu Lagoon. But then as the freeway was modified and widened, you start to see that we started to manipulate these sub-watersheds. And you can see the overlay here in that comparison between 1928 and 1944, where we fractured those watersheds. We made the water move in different ways because we were accommodating the roadway traffic. Why do we do this? We zoom into the fine details, then we zoom back out to the 30,000 foot level, right? To understand that we're doing this work within the context of a much larger area, right? Understanding where we're working and how these things tie into the decisions we're going to make about plant selection is critical. Understanding that all of the water that's coming off our site eventually makes its way through to the Malibu Lagoon and into the ocean. And then zooming back into the site, how do we modify things in the site to make sure that we're being responsible with how we're restoring hydrology or how we're accommodating water movement through the site? And taking areas like this and focusing on water that's essentially draining into a little drainage ditch along the on-ramp and kind of falling in unfettered into Liberty Canyon Creek, or what the structure is of the 101 freeway, which is essentially just a gigantic green roof on steroids. And how do we capture the water off of that and pull that back into space and have that be beneficial and actually feed the plant life that's part of the project. And then, you know, fun and goofy things like this, and I mean, I could nerd out for hours on this, but I'll be quick on geomorphology. We were talking about this a little bit at dinner beforehand, but there's something really unique about the project site in that most of the area to the north of the freeway and to the south of the freeway is sedimentary base material, but there's one location on the south side of the freeway where through that tectonic action, the ground plane basically folded up and the mantle injected up through. There's a little sliver of igneous stone that comes through in that location. So being able to understand how that geomorphology informs the soil health, right? So you've got that geomorphology, the weatherability, the physical weathering, the chemical weathering of the parent material, and how that leads into the soils that we've got on site. And then going a step further, as we're looking at the soil health on site, understanding that we're not just talking about the physical makeup, we're talking about the chemical makeup, we're talking about the biological makeup of that soil profile. And one of the biggest disruptors in this particular area to the soil biology was the intensity of the Woolsey fire. One of the members of our team, one of our soil scientists on our team, used to be a fire jumper in Arizona. And as we were doing one of our initial site assessments, he could see that the burn scar in the soil was about 14 to 16 inches down, meaning that it was an incredibly intense fire in this location, and it basically baked out all that biological activity, right? And so when you think about that in the context of things like that mustard coming back in, mustard is a non-mycorrhizal associated species, and so if you don't have that soil biology in place, and you already have the adventitious growth of that invasive species, and you don't have the other things that would support the native species, there's already a kind of a recipe for disaster there. So how can we think about and look to restore soil health as part of this? And so Joey will talk a little bit more about what we've got going on at the nursery in that regard. But it's a big part of the way we work with the soil biologists, the mycologists, and the soil scientists to develop a soil inoculant that we're using both in the nursery and we're supplying back to the contractor for use on the project to restore the soil biology in the profile. And then doing this sort of analysis, right? Understanding the way in which the mycorrhizal fungi is a part of the space that we're working in, understanding the quality and the quantity of what's there, and then being able to interpret and communicate the why piece of it, right? Because everybody, I've been talking about soil for only maybe like 3 minutes, and I think everybody's eyes are starting to glaze over a little bit. So getting into the fun stuff, right? So thinking about vegetation, one of the things that I get as somewhat snarky feedback quite frequently is, why is someone from Chicago working on a project about restoration in the Santa Monica Mountains? And it's a legitimate question, right? But ultimately it comes down to what I have as part of my skill set as a landscape architect. You know, I'm a generalist and I'm a collaborator, which means that I don't need to be the plant expert. I've got fantastic ones sitting right here in front of me. I've got fantastic ones that I've got as part of my design team. I've got all those biologists at Caltrans, all those horticultural experts that are part of MRCA and the National Park Service. So I don't have to be that person. I have to leverage the skill set of the collaborators, the team members that I've got to be able to work with and find thoughtful ways of moving forward. So we look at what we're doing for proposing the vegetation. We look at these different variables to understand what we're creating, because we are doing a lot of terraforming essentially on the site, changing grades, changing slope and aspect, understanding how water is changing on that site, and thinking about the plant selections, right? We're working in one of 36 biodiversity hotspots worldwide, and so there's a responsibility that comes with that. And so as part of what we've done in this project, you know, all of the, and Joy will speak to this here in a minute, but all of the plants for the project are being grown in a project nursery from seed that's been collected within a 5-mile radius from the project site, extending that genetic footprint and propelling that forward and reinforcing the biodiversity that's important in that location. Being able to take that intent, which actually came from a fun visit that I did to the Rancho Sierra Vista nursery with Antonio Sanchez, and I was there on a day right after there was a frost snap that came through, and there was a species of plant, to this day I can't remember what the plant was, But he had collected seed from Chesborough and collected seed from a stone's throw away from the nursery. And one of the two of them was able to, kind of got a little bit burned from that frost, and but it was still up and kicking the next morning. And the other one was completely decimated, right? Same exact plant, but where that seed had come from and the genetic sensitivity of that location was so incredibly important. And so that was really one of the impetuses for establishing the plant nursery and having that commitment and that investment and being thoughtful about where we source that seed from. And then finding ways to incorporate these types of concepts into Caltrans standards. And I love working with Caltrans, but it's a big organization. They've got their standards, they've got their variables. So trying to find ways to work within that system, work within that machine, right? Introducing concepts like open habitat and closed habitat as section labels in the drawing is fun. It's not really in the lexicon of all things in the cat world. But then we had to think about how we were going to deploy a planting strategy, right? Usually the way that I would look at a planting plan as a landscape architect is I would think about it in a very painterly way, like drifts of this plant and pockets of this plant, and thinking about it as an overarching canvas, right? But we had to think about how this was going to fit in to those standards for Caltrans. And so what we did is we actually developed a planting strategy that was about a collection of plants that need to be a part of that community in the coastal sage shrub community, which is really what's focused on top of the stage one infra and top of the structure. And then we fit it into the structural grid for the project by developing these little modules. And so when you put all of these modules together, we still have that painterly approach. We still have these kind of bleeded edges of species that kind of jump their way across from one spot to the next. But it allows us to put these plant palettes together in a unique way and be able to deploy them based on a grid pattern coming from the structural engineers. But anyway, as we went through this process and we got very specific about those plans, which I kind of jumped the gun and explained that, I probably should explain that on this slide. The question was really how are we going to ensure that the selection of native species is in fact representative of the location and something where we can continue that that ethos of biodiversity and building that plant palette up and reinforcing the uniqueness of the ecology. And so that's where the nursery came into play. So we had a concept sketch like this and said, hey, this is something that we need to do. Went to the project partners and they all looked at me like I was crazy, which I am, but that's okay. And then ultimately it became a conversation between the National Wildlife Federation being able to fund the nursery as part of the project, MRCA allowing us to use land that they manage, that's 2 exits to the east off of Las Virgenes, and helping us to establish the footprint of the nursery, and then this incredible collaboration with the National Park Service and the Salmon Fund to staff the nursery and really help make the nursery a reality. And so with that, Joey, do you want to go through a couple of slides there?
Hi everybody. Yeah, so this is really kind of like the ideal situation, right? If we had, for every project, we had our own nursery right next to the restoration site. It's like, oh my gosh, it's fantastic. When I first started talking to Robert about this, I was just so pleased because, this was before I think we even thought about the nursery, but just the idea, the understanding that these plants that were going to go over the crossing have to be native plants, because this is really about the habitat and trying to create a seamless transition between these 2 natural areas that have been separated for decades. So, there's wildlife that will be crossing this and not even realizing that they're crossing it, right? And the fact that we have a nursery right there, supplying the plants for that crossing, it just makes a lot of sense. It's a big, complex project, and so it's really helpful to have a local nursery right there. So this is a picture of Alan Salazar. He is a tribal elder and a consultant, works with Rock Designs and Associates from Tatavian tribe. And this is another really important component of the project is, bringing this perspective in. When you work with native plants, you're not just improving the habitat, right? You are preserving culture. Tribal people and native folks, this is their culture. They interact with the native plants. They celebrate native plants. It's part of their spirituality, it's part of their practices. And so when we have native habitat out there, we are actually preserving culture. So this is him giving a blessing for the nursery as it was breaking ground. It's really beautiful. And he's been with the project throughout, providing a tribal perspective, which is fantastic. All right, so this is the nursery starting to get built. So it wasn't on flat ground. It wasn't like in an ideal position for a nursery. We had to get it terraced, and the design team designed how it would get terraced so that we would have level ground and not get washed away, right? The tables were a big part of it. All the plants are lifted off the top of the ground. They're on tables to keep them healthy. And it involved a lot of labor. Catherine Packardini, the nursery manager for this, was fantastic. And I think really, just oversaw all the on-the-ground operations of this build. And working with the National Park Service and Salmon Fund to get people out there to help with the labor. It was a big, fantastic group project. There's a lot that goes into building infrastructure. This is a picture of Outward Bound Adventures, which is a partner of the park and the Salmon Fund. And they came out and helped on a regular basis, not just building the infrastructure, but also helping grow some of the initial plans for the project. So Robert had mentioned this about how the project is super local, right? It's hyper local. All the propagules for the project are collected within like a 5-mile radius. So they're not just California natives, they are actually indigenous to the Santa Monica Mountains region. They are locally native, and this is important because over time, the species that are in the Santa Monica Mountains region, although they are the same species as maybe what you have in Northern California, they have evolved to the specific environmental conditions of that region. So if we want our plants to survive into the future, and if we want to facilitate relationships with wildlife, we need to go native and go as native as we possibly can. So these are local genetics, which is a really important part of the project. And this is Julia Samaniego, who is also with the Tataviam tribe and is a assistant nursery manager. So she co-manages the nursery right now, and here she is collecting seed, and then she was also placing a strand of her hair, which is a practice along the plant. So it's not just a job for her, but a way for her to practice culture. And that's one of the great things about these nurseries, is that they're kind of like schoolhouses, they're places for people to learn, not just work with native plants, but to learn about them. And then here's just some cool pictures of some lupines on the hillside. And Catherine had taken these pictures when she was out collecting seed. This is literally what they're doing, is they're going along the side of the freeway, going to native populations and collecting seed, using that seed back at the nursery to propagate plants that will be placed over the 101 freeway. So here's some groups that are helping out the nursery. This is milkweed seed that they've been collecting. It's one of the staple plants for the crossing. So a great species for monarch butterflies, of course. And then another important component of the project is phytosanitary practices at the nursery. If you ever worked in nurseries, there are risks of spreading disease, and so they have a setup here where they are sterilizing soil and pots. Everything that they use gets sterilized first before they use it, so that the plants are healthy, but also we're not introducing anything into the natural environment. And here's a group of Outward Bound Adventures, and they're sowing seed into these really cool root pruning, air pruning pots. So this is pretty neat. If you've worked with plants, which most of you have here, I'm sure you pull a plant out of the pot and you might notice that it's root bound. Well, this technology has a bunch of perforations in the containers here, so that when the roots hit the air, it basically prunes them, and that creates more robust roots. Just the same way as if you were to prune a plant above ground, makes it more robust, creates more branching. It does that with the roots too. So it prevents that root bound plant, but it also creates a really healthy below ground structure of roots that's going to be more likely to survive when we plant it into the crossing. So here's some native grasses that'll go into the crossing, and here's an overall picture of the nursery, some of the first plants that were put in, everything from purple needlegrass, and there is also milkweed in there, and then coastal sage-grouse species like our native sages, purple sage, white sage, black sage, California buckwheat, your staple workhorse restoration species. Okay, this is super cool. This is the ectomycorrhizae, the mycorrhizae aspect of the project. So mycorrhizae is what we call a fungus that when it forms a relationship with the roots of a plant in a beneficial way. It's a mutualism. So both the fungus and the plant benefit. And so the fungus occurs with the relationship with the root of the plants. The root of the plants, it brings in water and nutrients, and then the plant feeds the fungus. Now, most plants have this relationship with mycorrhizae. But like Robert was mentioning before, our non-native plants sometimes cause problems either by bringing in pathogens or they just simply don't form that relationship with the plants, which is really essential. So what will happen is a plant like black mustard will take over an area, and if you remove it, because it doesn't form that relationship with the fungus, that area will be depleted of that fungus. So when you put the native plants in, they don't have the fungus to form that relationship with. And the fungus is essentially making the roots bigger. That's the best, kind of easiest way to think of it. So if you have your roots and you have just the roots by themselves, they're grabbing the water that they're touching, right? But if you have a fungus around them, now it's increasing the area. So the water can come from here and get pulled into the roots. And so it just increases their probability of survivorship. And one way to fix this problem of a lack of mycorrhizae is to inoculate the plants in the nursery setting with the mycorrhizae. So now you have these healthy plants that have the fungus and they're forming that relationship in the pot, in the nursery, and then you go out and you plant them and they have that relationship and they fill in the spaces in between through growth and through replication. So it's a super cool part of this project, and Catherine has some really cool pictures of plants that were inoculated with mycorrhizae and those that weren't, and the ones that were just taller and healthier and more leaves, and it really does make a difference. And so it's also cool that this project is not just benefiting the crossing, but it's a model that we can use. You know, people in this region can look at what was done with mycorrhizae, the soil component, and then replicate that, not just on crossings, but in restoration in general. So when Robert had brought this up to me, I was really excited about it, and I feel like I've learned a lot about this idea and seen it in action just from the design team introducing it to the project. So here's some pictures of what we call them ecopiles. So they're taking soil, putting them into these planter beds, and they're being inoculated with the fungus so that you can then grab from those soil piles and inoculate your nursery plants with them. So just a spoonful of soil, and you're off and running. And then another way that they're doing this work is by collecting mushrooms. And so this is the ectomycorrhizae. What's inside the soil is the arbuscular mycorrhizae is just inside the soil. And so there's two different groupings of mycorrhizae. The arbusculars does not form the fruiting bodies above the ground, the mushrooms, but ectomycorrhizae does. And so you can get really specific with this if you know what mushrooms are beneficial to certain plants. Like around oak trees, for example, there are certain mushrooms, ectomycorrhizae, and you can collect those mushrooms when they're fruiting, and then create a slurry, kind of blend them up, and a liquid that you then can pour into your tree plots, and that will end up accelerating that relationship. And this here is the mycologist Efren, who's been leading this work. He works with the design team, and there's some UCLA students there, I believe. So it's also that opportunity that who's going to collect the mushrooms? Well, we can have some students who are interested in this kind of work. Maybe it'll inspire career choice, but it's also that there's that opportunity for education that the nursery provides in this project in general. So here's a mushroom, and then there it is in the blender, right? So it's literally just going around and pouring it inside the pots, and it's that easy. I mean, it's more complicated, but you know, it's that easy. So yeah, a really, really cool component to this project. And then this is them looking at our vascular mycorrhizae. On the right, you see Efren on the left. On the right is Jose Campos, who's also co-managing the nursery at this time with Julia Samaniego, and both of them are doing a fantastic job. If you see some pictures here of the mycorrhizae community there, and some beautiful pictures of our native plants. I think we're getting towards the end here of the nursery. One of the cool things with the nursery too is that they're taking, they're basically landscaping the parts of the nursery where that can't be grown on. And so this is stabilizing the soils, but it's also providing some beautiful native plants and maybe a source for seed collection and a way to educate people when they come in as well. And so here's Julia Samaniego working with SAMO Youth, which is a youth group, 22 youth that come out in the summer from Oxnard in Los Angeles, so inner city youth, and they're hired through SAMO Fund to come out and do restoration program work in the mountains, and so they got a chance to work at the nursery, and then Julia here is also working with tribal youth and showing them some cultural practices. This is my favorite part of the nursery, is the fact that it is a schoolhouse, and it's a place for people to come out and experience community, an appreciation for native plants, but an appreciation for each other. I'll hand it over. Thanks you all for letting me talk about the nursery, I appreciate it.
We always end with the kittens. That's like that's a go-to joke in any presentation. It's always end with the kittens. So, any questions?
Will people be able to go back on the bridge?
So the question is, will people be able to walk across the bridge? It's a good question. We get that one a lot, and the answer to that is one of the things that's the most compelling thing about the project to me, and that is that, no, first and foremost, the answer is no. But early on in the design phase, one of the ways that Caltrans does their work is that they have to go and do these public meetings where they have to present alternatives. And one of those alternatives was to connect because there's a trail to the north, there's a trail to the south, and to connect it with the trail across the structure. And the wildlife biologists were, they're admittedly a little bit reticent about the idea of a trail across, but the thing about the species that we're dealing with, specifically the mountain lions, is that they're habituated to the anthropogenic use and humans being in their landscapes. And so they weren't terribly off-put by that idea, but it was the fervent response from the public, of the public coming back in those public comment periods saying, absolutely not, this is for wildlife only, right? And then being the community that's giving that edict, and that being a driving force of the project, which really says something about the commitment to to that initiative, and also the population that was there supporting the project.
Yeah, I appreciate, and I think all of this planning and everything is wonderful. But I guess my question in some ways is simplistic, in some ways is very complex, and maybe you're going to get there to talk about it, but obviously those that migrate back and forth have figured out ways to migrate back and forth, or they're not migrating back and forth. how are you gonna get the animals to go through it?
No, it's a good question, and it's not a small one, right? Ultimately, it's a combination of all of those people that I represented in that slide and all the collaboration that's there. It's using the expertise of the people that know different facets and how to define each of the ingredients, so to speak, of the gumbo. But what you'll, for those of you that are able to come on the tour on Saturday, what you'll see and what I'll point out is that there's a combination of several different factors that go into wildlife crossings. One of them that's important is, exclusionary fencing and having fencing that funnels wildlife to that crossing location. But as part of a design strategy, and you look at this from above, from an aerial view, those crossings are the center of the hourglass, right? And so you're funneling all this wildlife through. Well, there are ways that we can design that space that lead up to the crossing to give them those indicators, right? And I often make the joke that's like dropping the Reese's Pieces out for ET, right? We just have to figure out what Reese's Pieces, each of the species eat. But part of the strategy with this particular crossing is that entire structure over the freeway has to, and trust me, I could do a presentation that goes on for like 5 hours about some like really goofy details and things. But that entire structure is banked with the super elevation of the freeway to pitch back to the north, right? So the entire site is sloping from north to south, but that structure pitches back to the north. And so what we're doing is any of the water that's captured off that surface and any of the water we can capture off the freeway in that general location, we're actually taking all that water and we're routing it back into the site to create an ephemeral creek corridor that goes from the north side of the crossing all the way down to Liberty Canyon Creek. We're restoring all of the natural ridges and draw lines on the north side of the freeway because that's where a lot of the wildlife moves through. And so by connecting that hydrology back and creating restoring that connection, we're also restoring those conditions where the wildlife traverse through. And then by pairing that with the plant communities that are appropriate there and making sure that we're designing for everything from the microbial activity to the apex predator, we're putting an entire system back in place so that you're creating a fabric that they're going to traverse and they're going to make their way through. And that will give them that indicator. You're trying to connect all these different things and restitch them in the right location to facilitate that movement so that when you do deploy that fencing that I started this whole answer with, it's the belts and suspenders. It's the thing holding your pants up to make sure that it works. Because the rest of the design cue should be there to make sure that that connection works.
What is your timetable on this project? You didn't say anything about it. I mean, when are you going to open it for animals to honestly be able to cross it and use it on a regular basis before the public discovers it?
Sure. Well, my sarcastic answer is I wish it opened yesterday. But construction will continue through the end of 25, beginning of 26 is the estimate right now. There are 2 stages to the project. And so the big asterisk that goes after that statement is that the second stage is going to go out to bid this summer. And then once a contractor is on board for that second stage, we'll learn a lot more about construction logistics and their timeline too, so that'll adjust things too. But the target is end of 25, beginning of 26.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Can you talk about the water? You mentioned the water that you're storing this creek that was there somehow, but you also need water for the plants. What do you do?
Sure. So the natural hydrology that's there and what we're restoring, Liberty Canyon Creek makes its way down essentially from where the Calabasas landfill is at, down through the site, makes its way underneath the freeway, and then connects all the way back down through to Malibu Lagoon. And there's another creek on the south side that comes off of a draw location to the west and is routed in pipes underneath the development area to the west of the crossing site and kind of bounds our footprint on the south side. Those 2 things converge into the drainage way that moves south from there. And we're working to restore the adjacent hydrology with those restored ridge lines and draws. But with respect to the vegetation on the project site, there is irrigation as a part of the project across the entire site. Part of that is about establishment. Obviously, it's just a kind of knee-jerk reaction to how you would get plants to establish and make sure you can do something at this scale. Because we're talking about 13 acres worth of space, right? It's about a 1 acre piece over the roadway, and then another 12 acres of space north and south of the freeway. And the other key component of using that irrigation is that for that piece that exists over top of the 101 freeway, it's a giant green roof, like I said before. And so that soil depth is anywhere between 1 foot deep and 4 feet deep. So making sure that we can maintain soil moisture on the areas that are that are bearing on native soils, and the areas that are structured, so you have that continuity, so that we don't end up with a glowing green postage stamp in the middle of August over top of the freeway. But we do have that reciprocity and soil moisture content across the entire thing, because we're creating a giant layer of artifice across the freeway. And so finding ways to build that system so it replicates the areas on either side depends on having the irrigation as a way to sustain that.
So with a timeline of a few years, I assume that most, if not all of those plants that you're propagating in the nursery are not going to be installed for 2 or 3 years. Will they be that large and mature at that time, or it seems like you're propagating them quite far in advance?
Sure. So there's a couple ways to answer that. The first one is that stage 1 will, in terms of its planting timeline, that'll start to get planted towards the end of this calendar year. And so the plants that we're growing in the nursery right now are growing and sizing up to the gallon and 3 gallon. I think 3 is the largest for stage 1. For some of the plants, like that'll be part of stage 2, especially some of the oaks that we're growing, or the walnuts. For things like that, we need a little bit more time to get to something of substance. Starting those sooner gives us a little more time to grow those on, so those are ready for stage 2. So that is a unique balancing act that if we were simply buying the plants from a nursery, we kind of cue that into yearly production schedules. But for this, we're adjusting and amending that production schedule based on how the project is being built out and having to react to that. So it does introduce a degree of complexity, but the benefit of what we're doing is that we also are able to use some of those plants that we may be growing as overstock for that work that we're doing in the nursery to fit out and kind of landscape that area and restore that area in the nursery itself as our seed stock from that stage. And then there's another fun project that Joey and I are working on with some seed farming stuff too, so we're able to leverage it for that as well.
What about noise from traffic, cars and trucks? Is there any mitigation for that, or
There is, and if I would have included that in this presentation, it would have been, instead of 100 pages, it would have been 300. I'll talk about that a little bit more on Saturday when we're out on site, but just to give you the Cliff Notes version of that, we've all driven along the freeway and you see those concrete sound walls, right? And those are meant as a way of mitigating sound for development areas. Those are really good at mitigating high and medium frequency sounds at about a 5 decibel reduction on average. And a lot of that is, there's a little psychosomatic component of that too, the out of sight, out of mind component of that. When you put something up and you can't see the traffic, you're not quite as bothered by the hum. For us, it was more important to understand that we needed to attenuate sound at a frequency level. And so I had been working with an acoustic engineer, and it took about 6 or 7 phone calls of people hanging up at me or laughing at me about trying to attenuate sound along the freeway instead of acoustic engineers who do that in concert halls and venues like that. But ultimately we're creating these large earthen barriers specifically so that we can attenuate low frequency sound for those species that will be, that will inhabit the spaces adjacent to the freeway that are more impacted by the low frequency sound. Because that sound attenuation and the artificial light attenuation have a huge impact on the stressors for the kind of the biological factors for the species that exist in there.
3 quick things. How wide is it? And is there any worry that it's going to be a corridor also for wildfire to cross the freeway? And third, are there examples that were studied from elsewhere, and where are they? That
Sure. All great questions. So the crossing width from north to south across the freeway is 210 feet, and the length of it along the freeway from east to west is 174 feet. And that width is keyed into a large body of research on the efficacy of crossings, and overcrossings in particular, to accommodate the most diverse suite of species. And this actually dates back to a lot of work and a lot of research and a lot of white papers that Tony Clevenger, who's a member of our design team, has done and studied over the years in collaboration with a lot of other folks. But there are a series of wildlife crossings that are reference points for any of the work like this that we do. But I don't think there's one that's more significant, more important than the series of crossings that go across the highway between Calgary and Banff, through the Canmore area. There are a series of crossings there that have been in place for quite some time, and that's where Tony actually got his start, was doing a lot of the research on that, and the efficacy and all the different components that go into it. And so it really is that research and that history and that knowledge base from Tony and his contemporaries and the other wildlife biologists that are part of the team that have studied these connected spaces and how those are infusing in that design process. And relative to your question about wildfire, wildfire is just, it's a reality, and it's something that's, it's going to affect the site at some point. There are a couple of things that we've done to try to improve the chances of rebound and resilience as a part of it. One of them is really this investment in the soil biology component. The more that we can create a healthy and vibrant native plant community, the lower intensity potential of the fire, meaning that it won't bake out as much of that soil ecology. But the other thing from a very pragmatic perspective is that by having an irrigation in place and having some overhead spray components as part of that, when there is a wildfire in the area, it gives us the potential of saturating that to give us a little bit of buffer. But in reality, if you speak to anybody who lives in that area, who experienced the Woolsey fire in that area, it was all ember driven. It jumped the freeway like that. And you're not really gonna stop that. Those salmon winds are just gonna push that directly across, and it's gonna catch them on, right? So we're just trying to find ways to improve the resiliency and the rebound, as opposed to finding ways to truly arrest it, because it's a natural process, so we have to find ways to work with. Yes, sir.
How do you plan to collect data to monitor how effective this is? And could we be able to say this much wildlife went across these many animals, these many plants, these many birds, etc.?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in addition to that, that story that I told about being at Rancho Sierra Vista with Antonio, one of the other early conversations that we had about this project was, how do we design it for maintenance, which seems a little bit counterintuitive. Like, for those of you that are landscape architects in the room, the idea that you're starting with maintenance as opposed to having your maintenance meter be the last thing you do is kind of counterintuitive. But that strategy of understanding and really that deployment of those modules for the planting palette allows us a vehicle by which MRCA, as they maintain that vegetated surface, we're able to track successional growth, we're able to track successes and failures for the plant community. But really when it comes to that monitoring of the use of the crossing, it's us continuing to build upon the research that Seth and Jeff have invested the better part of their careers in, by creating a monitoring and evaluation plan that's layered into the design process. And so there's monitoring equipment that will be deployed as part of the project to monitor what comes across the crossing and start to factor in those different things using the best available technology that we can get.
Is anything being done to restore the plant communities that were burned out by the Woolsey? Get rid of the mustard and bring in?
Yeah, so, no, it's a good question. And ultimately, a lot of that is being done by MRCA already. They've been working on that ever since the Woolsey fire to restore some of those areas and trying to work in areas that aren't going to be disrupted by construction. And the other benefit of looking at this way and using the planting approach that we're using is that it allows that area to be a seedbed for continued restoration moving out from the crossing site too, because it's an ongoing endeavor to restore those areas. And there isn't a single time that I've been on the project site I haven't seen MRCA out there doing planting work or maintaining the seedlings that they've put on the north side in the area that got burned along the creek. Or Alberto out there saving the 6-foot-long California king snake that was making its way into the roadway. So those efforts are underway, and it's something that MRCA is constantly doing. In the same way that Joey does a lot of that work in restoration for the areas that he manages as well. So it's a constant onslaught. Yeah.
I want to thank you both for that great talk. It was really I'm very touched at the diverse collaboration, that's the word that kept coming up, how far-reaching those collaborations are. It's very moving to see all that, and you shared that very effectively in your presentation, and I'm sure that is just a very small section of what goes in. It's overwhelming. It's hard for me to even speak about it. It's so beautiful to see all the diverse populations, be it plant or human, together on this project. It's just fascinating. It reminds me of the mycorrhiza and how everything is, all the people are connected, and the mycorrhiza is connecting everything. It's a beautiful circle. And I'm so curious, both of you, Robert, for you, what is your North Star with this project? What gets you excited to get up in the morning for this?
Well, there's what I should say, and there's the opposite. What I should say is it's about the wildlife, but for me, it's about the people. It is. I mean, I thrive on working with creative people, intelligent people, great collaborators. And I mean, I've got one of the best ones right here next to me, right? And Joey is one of those people as a hallmark for me. Somebody that has that level of passion and commitment to the work that they do, right? And having the opportunity to work with a number of people like that across this project team. One of the questions that I think I got asked in one of the university presentations I did recently was how many people were working on the project, how many people I was working with, and I joked that I stopped counting at 125. And there's some truth to that, but I mean you're talking about large organizations with people that are incredibly vested in this, right? And with all of those people that I get to work with at Caltrans, that all have their own unique special qualities and things that they're experts in, and that the fact that I've got members of the structural construction team talking about the soil profile that's got to go into the project, and understanding and comparing the uniqueness and the detail of that to a concrete spec, and those moments like that where there's kind of cross-pollination. It really is that collaboration with all of these members of the design team that drives me and gets me excited.
That's awesome.
Thank you. That's a really good question. Originally when I got into the Park Service, I just wanted to be outside. That was like my happy place. It made me feel better for my mental health, my physical health. But then I started learning about ecology, and I really fell in love with natural areas and being able to tell this green thing from that green thing over there, and how they're different, and then they're related. Oh my gosh, it kind of just, I was constantly enlightened, and I feel like I'm never bored. But I do think probably, my star is, again, it probably is the people too. I love working with volunteers. I love particularly working with youth. I think inspiring youth is really, that's the best strategy we have for our future. And then I just love the National Park Service mission, which is to preserve cultural and natural resources for us now, but also for future generations. And so it's been termed America's best idea. And when you really think about it, a lot of the work that I'm doing is in restoration, when I'm planting trees that I may never sit in the shade of. And that's like a trick to think of, that we're trying to, we're improving things now for us, but we're improving things for our kids and their kids, and maybe 1,000 years from now, there could be a group sitting here and a park ranger and a landscape architect talking about the next project, but also being able to go out into the natural world and experience the places that we preserved and protected. So I kind of see it as like, Robert and myself and the people on this project are in the group that's trying, right now, and collectively we're making a difference. So for me, that's kind of my star. That's what keeps me going.
That's beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Take a couple more questions.
Obviously, you're talking about a crossing, and obviously you're talking about a lot of flora. Do you anticipate 3 to 5 years after this is complete that you will have a population of fauna living on the crossing itself?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately that's kind of inherent in the idea of creating this large ecological stitch, right? Some of, I kind of quickly glossed over the page about home range, right? So you have the species that will make their way across the crossing where this is a conduit for them, right? And those are the ones that, they're the glorious megafauna, right? All those banner species that we see and refer to. But for some of those species, it's creating their home, for generations, right? You're gonna have the rattlesnakes that are not gonna move that far off the project site. And trust me, there's quite a few of those there, and it's a species that I don't necessarily have a fondness for. I've got a respect for it, but got kind of a snake thing, a bit of a phobia there. Sorry, it's a little bit of a sidebar. But like harvester ants, right? That will make their home in the earthen barriers along the freeway that are part of the sound wall, right? Where you're going to end up having these populations, and I think that goes part and parcel with the question about monitoring, right? We're going to see what species end up inhabiting that space, what species are making their way across, frequency, the intervention, right? Some of the things we're doing with monitoring the sound, right? We've been working with a gentleman named Clint Francis out of Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, to capture the sound in about a dozen different locations pre, during, and post construction, so that we can then analyze that data in collaboration with the monitoring cameras to understand what species are making their way through, what things may be turning around as a result of that sound. And I think another piece that will be interesting is seeing what species will inhabit closer to the freeway with that sound attenuation as a result.
Yes. So I also have 3 questions. I also want to start by saying the thing that when you said that they would be crossing it without even knowing that they would be crossing it, I think that struck me the most inspiring. And you hear all this doom and gloom, everything that we do to destroy habitat and animals, and so thank you for that. To see this happening, and I think my first question was answered by studying this picture, because it was, what will we see as motorists? And so it took me a while to figure out. So the white is the sound wall, and that's a truck crossing.
The truck going underneath, yeah.
Right. So that's what we'll see is the wall.
Yeah. So what you'll see, and yeah, I guess I'm gonna have to update this rendering. And maybe have some other ones from the driver vantage point. But what you'll see, one of the fun things that we've done as part of that design process is finding ways to not only address the sound and the artificial light, with those vegetated berms along the parallel of the freeway. But what we've also done is we've taken that sound wall and the structure and stepped it back off of the edge a bit and put a vegetated buffer on the front side of it, so that you'll see an exterior concrete barrier, but then you'll see this vegetated slope going up to the sound wall on top of the structure. So you'll see a band of vegetation stretching across from north to south. That will be what you're meeting as you're coming to the structure. And then in addition to that, and this kind of goes back to the question about sound and light impacts, the other thing that we've done is we've, instead of using a conventional concrete, so this rendering is still shown as like a conventional concrete color. One of the other pieces that we've worked on with Dr. Travis Longcourt from UCLA, who's helped us with a lot of artificial light impacts, and he's someone who had theorized that the way the P22 got to different parts was basically along the darkest potential route. Why that matters and why I'm answering, or why I'm explaining this in the context of answering your question is that being able to design a structure that leverages the best possible knowledge also includes changing the color of that structure to reduce the surface reflectivity index of the concrete so that you don't get what's called sky glow. Your headlights bounce off of something that bounce off a particle in the sky and creates overarching glow. So what we've done is we've actually infused the concrete with a pigment, with an ergo pigment, so that it has kind of a dusty mocha type color. So it'll feel more like you're seeing this band of that soil layer and the vegetation stretching across the freeway. I mean, it'll still be very much architectural. We'll see the nice, clean, straight lines. But the idea that we're infusing this kind of design pedagogy with some kind of technological innovations, specifically to target that reduction in impact to the wildlife, is a nice way of kind of blending the two.
Will there be trees on the?
Not on the structure itself. No, there's not. It's for a couple of reasons. One is that the soil volume is going to be fairly limited on top of the structure, just because of the dead load and the requirements from structural engineers. But also because you don't necessarily want that parcel over the roadway to be the spot where you've got a lot of things stopping and dwelling. You really want those larger species to make their way across. And so focusing that plant community on the coastal sage shrub community and keeping all that vegetation a little bit lower allows us to create a better composition of open and closed habitat. And if you would have had the trees up there, you would have had a whole series of other variables to deal with there, and things overhanging in the roadway and stuff like that today.
Okay, final question. Being a gardener, always think about maintenance. So I assume you'll want to have minimal footprint once it's completed, or will it be follow-up, things die?
Oh no, this is gonna be Bronco Beal set it and forget it, you know? No, so there will be maintenance, right? There will need to be that tending hand, especially at the onset. But the hope is that as things get established, that we'll be able to scale that back over time. But it's important to also realize that this is a manufactured landscape. It's a restoration project, but it's a manufactured landscape. It does have that need for tending. It will need that level of inspection, both from the standpoint of inspecting the systems that are in play and the structure that's in play, but it's also a learning laboratory in some respects too. So being able to go out there and analyze what successes, what failures, you know, what plants are evolving through that successional growth will be a part of it too. So there is a human component of it that I think will always have to be there, but you're talking about maintenance crews that are out there on an infrequent basis to do that sort of tending that you would need to do in a space like this.
I think transportation officials probably learned a lot with the reconstruction of the 6th Street Bridge over the LA River recently. How are you going to keep people off of this overpass?
Joe's going to camp on one end and I'm going to camp on the other.
You know, you can't fence it because you fence out the wildlife. So.
Sure. No, it's a good question, and it's another one we get a lot. And I think there are a couple things there. Like one is that we could plant plants that deter people from going up there. You know, we could plant a bunch of poison oak, you know, or a bunch of yucca or something like that. So it's nice and spiny. Like one of my best jokes about doing my plant walkabouts with Catherine was her warning me of how sharp the end of the yucca plant was, and of course I put my thumb on it just to. Absent-minded, hadn't had enough coffee that morning, pricked my thumb and just applied for the rest of it. But no, so there's strategies like that to plant species that are going to deter people. There's things like putting up rattlesnake habitat signs that'll keep me off of it. And also, I mean, you're talking about in many locations the grading challenges, especially in the south side, are going to be steep enough that people aren't going to want to go there necessarily. But I think that probably the most important piece of deterring people from going onto that crossing is all of that work that's happening around communication and education right now. to make sure that people understand the intent. And then there's also the accessibility piece of it. So there is going to be an observation point that's up on the mountain slope to the south, an observation overlook, where people can hike up on the trail that exists and be able to see the crossing from a distance and be able to see what's happening and get that vantage point and those kind of selfies that they want. Excuse me. And then, you know, even right now, there's a camera that's pointed at the construction site that's running constantly, so you can check in on the construction progress, and that's meant to continue in the future too, so people can see it digitally. So I think by providing a platform for people to observe it from safe distance, providing that level of accessibility, providing that level of education, it'll deter most of the people that will want to make their way up there. And, you know, I'm one of those kids that probably still would have gone up there and messed with things anyway when I was in my youth, so they're going to have that anyway, and we'll have to deal with that. But hopefully that's an outlier and not something that's a regular occurrence. About one more question?
Sort of an odd question, but I'm wondering with your work, especially with Caltrans or other maybe folks who haven't worked in like wildlife restoration, if you've seen some like encouraging like, oh, we can do this again, like yeah, this isn't that big a deal, like well let's have some more over wildlife oversight. Are you seeing that maybe this could like become a blueprint and could be replicated, or was it like this is the one time we're doing this, like what sort of attitude, like temperature check?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great question. And you know, I could tell you that everything is rosy and peachy, and that yeah, everybody's going to do it. They're going to, you know, everybody's going to love it, and it's going to be fantastic. And then the reality is that it already has changed hearts and minds. I mean, the fact that you've got people that are watching this project from afar and understand the importance and the novelty of it, and are making things like wildlife crossings enough part of the public discourse that they're not this weird activity. It's already happening, right? Could it happen faster? Absolutely. Will it? Probably not, but we'll just keep trying.